So my name is Eoin. I'm director of the UCD Earth Institute. So thanks and welcome for attending here. Some of you may not have realized this is actually a UCD building in the city centre. So it's great to have this outlet to bring our research to wider society in the city centre. So the Earth Institute, it's UCD's interdisciplinary centre for environment, climate and sustainability research. So it's the largest research institute in UCD, has about 200 academics and another 250 PhDs and postdocs. So it's the largest research centre in the university. And one of the motivations we have is to push, to connect more of the research that's been done by those academics and researchers out into society. So, and connect more with policymakers, politicians, civil society more generally. And as part of that, that's the purpose of sort of initiating this series. So it's one of the other motivations is it's a really big year for elections. So we have local elections, European elections. We may have at some point a general election in the next year or so. But about 60 countries comprising more than 50% of the global population are having elections this year. So I thought it was really a good idea to try and showcase the kind of research that should be helping inform policy and informing debates and dialogue on environmental, climate, sustainability kind of issues. Even yesterday, it does appear that the nature restoration law in Europe may not come to pass, but hopefully something else might come in its place. So we're focusing on democracy and the environment. The first event today is on rural transitions. So we have 3 speakers. I'll speak briefly about that in a second. We have a second event on expert advice in the environment on the 30th of April. I might just mention the speakers at that before I mention the speakers for today, if that's all right. So we've got 3 people from UCD, Finbar Burton, Simon Mooney, Linda Fox-Rogers. Hopefully have Anne Graham, CEO of the National Transport Authority, Jane Timmins from the ESRI. So one of the motivations is to have a policy kind of connection at each one of these seminars or panels. So today we have Keaveney from the UCD School of Agriculture and Food, Kieran Harrahill from TASC and Biorbic, which is an SFI Centre for the Bioeconomy. And we'll have Dr. Andrew Forde from the Department of Rural and Community Development. So with that, I'll hand over to Karen, who's basically running today's event. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eoin, and thanks everybody for being here. I have too many things in my hand here. So first of all, thanks. I think Eoin has expertly introduced the whole series. I was delighted to be asked to help, at least in some part, organise the rural transitions, especially as the first in this series. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers. There's going to be 2, myself and Kieran, giving very brief presentations. I have to put a timer on for myself because I always talk too much. And then I'm delighted that we're joined by Andrew Forde, who will be our respondent and panelist. So we would like a discussion. The 2 brief presentations are very much around kind of whetting the appetite and getting the conversation going. So please, we'll be only delighted to have a conversation. Okay. What I'll do first of all is introduce myself. My name is Keaveney. I'm based in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. I'm a geographer and a planner by background. I've become more involved with the Earth Institute over the past few years, and it's great to be part of a group of connected and networked academics within the university who are interested in the environment overall and all the different strands that it involves. I co-lead the Sustainable Communities research team within the Institute, and I also run the Masters in Sustainable Agriculture and Rural Development. So in terms of today, I'm going to focus more so on towns, and I'm going to give you a couple of snapshots of some projects that are coming to an end at the moment. Kieran, who I'll introduce you properly once I'm finished. Kieran will be speaking more on the environmental side of things and on the People's Transition Project. And as I said, Andrew will be our respondent. So I think this is all working. Right, so I'm going to just talk about the key issues, the sort of dominant issues within rural areas at the moment, and how that's influencing some of the challenges that we're having at the moment. And I'm going to give you a snapshot from the Citizen Rural Project, which is an Irish Research Council project, and also the In Place project, which is co-funded by a consortium of policy agencies, including the Office of the Planning Regulator. And in the end, we'll look at some policy opportunities. So hopefully we can see that. Really, not to mention COVID, but to mention COVID, of course, it really did highlight the vulnerabilities of rural areas that are going under incredible change environmentally, socially, and economically, regardless. But COVID, in many ways, I think marked a real change, particularly in Ireland, in terms of how we look at rural places. It opened it up possibly as a place to live for more people. However, given the less diversified economy, there's less access to work, and there's less diversified jobs. A high share of workers can't necessarily work from home. So many of those who do work from home have a certain type of professional job or are moving to rural places, and I'll talk about that in a while. There's poor access to services, a larger digital divide, and of course we know there's an aging population, and these are just very quickly a snapshot of some of the challenges in rural areas at the moment. When we look at some of the key issues, the OECD has identified 6 megatrends that will influence rural success. And again, very briefly, aging and migration is one of those key areas, and it's something that particularly around migration we're seeing globally. Urbanization, global shifts in production, the rise of emerging economies, climate change and environmental pressures, and technological breakthroughs. So these are really important factors that are influencing rural change and the success of rural areas into the future. And it's really trying to understand through our research, how can we harness some of these, but also address the challenges that these pose. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about a project that's just coming to an end that we partnered with the Department for Rural and Community Development with, called Citizen Rural. And this project examined what mattered to people in rural areas, and also then what data do we need to really understand these rural places. So just very briefly, I thought it was important to understand a big, oh, that happened, oh yeah, thanks. You know, a big debate is actually what is rural. And while that can be a very academic debate, we also see it as it's a struggle in policy, because actually defining what the rural is has major implications for the policies we then design. And so you know, on one hand, it's something I love talking about a lot myself, but actually it has a series, it does set the agenda for what we're talking about. So in this project, which was based in County Roscommon, one of the key areas we did talk about is what is rural. And people really defined those around values, functions, and challenges. So the values were very positive, and it was about peace and space, and freedom was a word that was used a lot. And also the function of so the traditional functions around agriculture, but also the role of the towns and villages and urban places, and transport. Transport was talked about a lot, and connectivity around that. But then challenges came out massively. So people see a lot of challenges in societal isolation, but also getting this sense that they feel a little bit forgotten and lacking, and that there's need that isn't being fulfilled or addressed. And what came out in that study as well is also this feeling of frustration that they're not part of decision making. So flipping to another project, which it also is coming to an end, which is the In Place study, which has been examining commuting in 7 rural towns around the island of Ireland. And I'll just focus on the south for this. Really, this is reflecting the renewed recognition of the town as engines for rural growth. And we can see that very strongly in our rural policy and in the national planning framework. But interestingly, we selected towns that had at the time, it was based in 2016 census data, where, you know, over 1/5 of the houses were new, where there was over 1/5 of people commuting certain distances. And what we were really seeing in certain towns was the growth. The growth is speeding ahead of national averages in those towns. So we can really see that where towns are attracting people in, the growth is there. Some of the towns we looked at were Ennistimon, Newtown Mount Kennedy, Mount Bellew, Kanturk, and Sallins. So it was quite a variety of towns that we looked at in that project. Yeah. So then also looking at, and my colleague Brendan O'Keefe is here, who also is working on that with me, You looked here at the slide. I'm very bad with my left and right. Anyway, the other far away slide from me. The kind of the peachy color is the island of Ireland population by age, whereas the red is the study towns that we used. And you can really see in that family formation age, 30 to 45, we have very, very strong numbers there. So again, higher than the national average. And again, in the young age where school, childcare, all of those things are issues, again, higher numbers. So what we're really starting to see, and I suppose it's part of a bigger issue around balanced regional development, is that the towns are playing a very strong role in bringing people in and for growth, but then there's ensuing then a demand for services that come from that. One of the elements, because this was a commuting study that we were doing, was, you know, looking at working from home, and quite a few of our respondents had changed their patterns since COVID in particular. And you know, one of the questions is, what is the future of remote working? And for a lot of our respondents, employers were very supportive or moderately supportive of flexible working arrangements. And there was an overall sense from that project that remote working was going to stay, bearing in mind that a lot of these towns were like an over 45-minute commute, and really the patterns around commuting have changed in terms of not looking at it daily but weekly. Finally, on this one, just in terms of when people talked about work and the sustainability of work, they did talk a lot about changing to a hybrid model, changing commuting patterns, how their employer actually, what their attitude was to it. You know, a lot of people saw it as a positive change. And in that quote there, it's quite a long quote, but I'll chance reading it. So if I could find a job that was 10 minutes up the road walking and it wasn't as well paid, I'd take that. Because COVID has made everybody, a lot of people realizes the quality of life is more important than work. So being at home allows you to do a few bits and pieces and people around the house, or go out for a lunchtime walk or meet up with somebody. It's just the flexibility that it brings. And I just always think this part is interesting. Before COVID, I would have been very driven from a promotional perspective and trying to make myself super and then trying to build empires and stuff like that. But since then, I don't really, it's more about a relaxed way. It's better. So the commute is worth the money, but if I could get a 5-minute walking commute for less money, I'd snap their hand. I think really people are increasingly talking about quality of life when we speak to them in rural areas, that it's housing was a driving factor, but quality of life is massively important. Overall, from that project, commuting from rural settlements was a trade-off between housing related considerations, particularly the cost to travel cost. The level of remote working post-pandemic in our study areas remains above the average, so home working is quite popular. Housing is often mentioned as a reason for moving, but family comes secondary then. So it's really showing that a lot of people are returning, and proximity for support networks are really important. The car is the most dominant travel mode, but interestingly, commuters by public transport are the least satisfied with their commute. So finally, just to go back to the other project I was talking about, Citizen Rural. As part of our project, we did a lot of qualitative work, and we started creating mind maps around policy areas. So we asked people, what's working in policy? So for a lot of people, broadband, education, quality of life is working, transport, particularly local link, and the rural regeneration, and particularly they've identified the funding as being quite successful there. However, when we ask for opportunities, it starts getting a little bit messier. And there's still a sense that there's a lot of gaps. So people feel they want access, resources, they feel there's a lot more resources, but are they being used in the right way? Do we have capacity? There's a sense that people want to engage in policy. They want to be part of democratic decision making, but don't always know how to be. They want policy to be people-centered with a strong emphasis on infrastructure and funding, but I suppose everybody always wants more funding. So I leave you on that slide with my presentation, and I'm going to go straight to Kieran, but we'll have questions afterwards. So Kieran, Kieran is currently working as a senior researcher in climate justice with TASC, which is the think tank, that's always hard to say, for action on social change. Kieran is leading a nationwide initiative called the People's Transition, and he's going to be speaking about that today. Kieran has recently completed his PhD in UCD, which was around a farmer-centred approach to understanding Ireland's bioeconomy in the context of just transition. So I'll hand you over to Kieran.
Thanks for that, Karen, and good morning, everyone. My name is Kieran Harrahill, and I'm a senior researcher in climate justice with TASC. And the intention for my presentation today is to give a brief overview of the People's Transition Initiative. Right, so not a day goes by when we don't see, either within the media or before our very eyes, the impacts which climate change is having upon people and upon communities across the world. Whether this be issues like severe drought, the impact of severe weather events, it's true to say that changes are needed to how we live, how we work, and how we commute in order to reduce the impacts of climate change. It's true, however, to say that for many people and for many communities, there are needs and challenges that are far more immediate and far more direct. Whether this be within a rural context, the need for accessible public services, issues around achieving housing, as well as a lack of local and sustainable employment, there is the risk that climate change will be seen as something which is distant or something which doesn't have an immediate impact upon communities. The basic idea of the People's Transition is that for climate action to be fast, it must be fair. For it to be enduring, it must be inclusive. Rather than climate action only being seen as policies which come from decision makers here in Dublin applied upon rural communities that might not connect with the lived experience of rural communities, or there's a sense that it makes life more difficult for rural communities. The objective of the People's Transition is to go to a diverse range of communities across Ireland to understand, first of all, what do people like most about their local areas, but also what do they see as being the challenges that they're experiencing or what is lacking within those communities. And from that, we seek to work with communities to develop solutions which have a local and a tangible benefit for a community while also having an environmental benefit also. The People's Transition model is something which emphasises the lived experiences, the stories, and the wants of a community. It's something which is based on the principles of community-led local development. It seeks to support community wealth building, and it also seeks to support the community ownership of the transition to a more sustainable future. TASC is very fortunate to have the opportunity to work on this project with the support of AIB. Back in 2021, TASC was supported by AIB in applying the People's Transition within two pilot locations, so two very different areas. One was in Phibsborough in the north side of Dublin, and the other one was in Ardara, a small village on the west coast of Donegal. Following on from that, TASC, with the support of AIB, is working with a range of communities across the island of Ireland to understand what are the immediate challenges which they are experiencing and how can climate action help to create benefits for communities. From working with a range of communities, we've completed the People's Transition 3 communities so far. A number of themes have emerged, which I want to briefly talk about within this presentation. Before we move on to that, I just have some images of the People's Transition in practice. So the image furthest to the right was from a focus group in the Temple Shannon area of Enniscorthy in County Wexford. The community to the bottom left, has actually already been mentioned, is Mount Bellew in County Galway. And the image on the top left was from a report launch back in December, which was focusing on the future of farming in County Roscommon. In terms of some of the main themes which have emerged, again, as Karen mentioned already, is a sense that within many rural communities, there's a lack of input or ownership within decision-making. So again, the first community which was part of the People's Transition in this phase was Enniscorthy in County Wexford. So while it is a town with a population of around 20,000, it's important to consider this within a rural context because it is outside of the 5 main urban centres here in Ireland, and that has an impact particularly around the issue of services. So again, community members in Enniscorthy felt that they were being left behind when it comes to securing funding, input within decision-making, primarily because of the location of Enniscorthy within County Wexford. As Karen mentioned in her presentation, to the north you have Gorey, which is a commuter belt, a thriving town, and then to the south of the county of Wexford Town, which is the county town, and it has resources like the SETU campus is based in Wexford Town. Again, my colleague Roisin Graney worked on a border transition project that consisted of 6 small communities along Lough Macnean, which is on the border between the North and the Republic of Ireland. Within a community survey, 75% of respondents said that they felt that they had no real ownership in local development projects, and that is a major challenge within the community. So again, one example of this was a planned wind farm where community members felt that they had no ability to have their say in terms of the risks it could have on sensitive local environments. So again, it is that example of a top-down approach to decision-making, which is very relevant when we think about climate action. Again, a final project which I'd worked on at the end of last year was also in County Roscommon, focusing on the future of farming in Roscommon. And one of the real themes which emerged from that project was a sense that farmers were not receiving support from decision makers. And this was really illustrated in one quote when a farmer spoke of how, when there's a problem, you're penalised, you're left with the problem. A second common theme has been a lack of employment opportunities for sustainable employment, as well as opportunities for community wealth building. So one community which I'm currently working with is a collective of 3 small villages or townslands, Ballylongford, Asti and Beal, which are located on the Shannon Estuary in North Kerry. And as you can see from this quote, 15 to 20 jobs here is the same as 2,000 in Dublin in terms of the indirect benefits that would have within that local economy. Again, as I mentioned, with regards to Enniscorthy, it's a town which 20 or 30 years ago would have had a range of industrial employment, such as in steelworks and in the agri-food sector. But as has been the case in many contexts, both in Europe and North America, many of those industrial jobs have been lost and no new jobs have come to replace them. And a really insightful example of this is in the 2016 Enniscorthy census. Within the centre of the town, 1 in 3 people were unemployed. So it goes to show that lack of investment or lack of new opportunities, how that can result in more immediate needs rather than climate action. Again, as Eoin mentioned, with regards to nature restoration, the issues of how farming will adapt to climate action is something which is very relevant. Within our work with farmers in Roscommon, they identified that there is a lack of sustainable income for farmers, particularly in the beef and sheep sectors, which are predominant in County Roscommon compared to maybe the dairy sector, which is more in place in the south of the county. So farmers identified a range of issues such as input costs, the structure of value chains, as well as the need for off-farm employment to supplement or ensure the sustainability of farms. So what's been great about working on the People's Transition is that we have the opportunity to work with communities, identify their needs, and then work to try to develop co-created solutions. So within Enniscorthy, one of the major themes which had been identified, again, as Karen had mentioned in her presentation, was a lack of public transport accessibility and how that can impact access to services and access to employment. Following on from the People's Transition in Enniscorthy, TASC collaborated with researchers in UCD and Trinity College and secured SFI funding for the Conundrum project, which is focusing on developing and co-creating shared and sustainable mobility. So that's an 18-month project with the potential for a further 2 years based on putting the findings into action from community input. So while that's obviously positive, there are of course challenges, and it is again the need for accessible funding, particularly with regards to issues around match funding or the dependence on volunteerism and the need for volunteers to apply for funding. Just one example I'd give is in terms of the Just Transition Fund. Again, as Karen mentioned, I've just finished up a PhD on the Just Transition. While it's great that the Department of Agriculture now has bioeconomy funding, so there is, I think, 5 million available for 2 bioeconomy projects, which could have great potential. There is a requirement on match funding. So if you're, for example, a sheep farmer where the average income is about 16,500 euro, you're probably not going to be in a position where you have the capital needed to apply for the funding. So definitely some support or some measure around that in terms of supporting communities and not just solely relying on those who already have the capital who might then be able to access funding. Again, to conclude, on this map, you can see the range of communities that we are working with. The white are the 2 pilot projects. The pins and green are the communities we've completed the People's Transition in. The pink are further communities we'll be working with, and then blue are connected projects, such as a Just Transition strategy for County Clare or work with Ballyharra local development. So again, the basic idea behind the People's Transition is that by understanding what are the immediate challenges that communities are facing, we can then look to develop climate solutions which have a local benefit while also having a wider environmental benefit. Communities that we've worked with have identified a number of issues, such as the need for greater community input in decision-making, the need for more local employment opportunities to address, again, a lack of opportunities in rural areas, as well as better accessibility towards transport. So while academia can, of course, play a really central role by undertaking an engaged research, policy supports, particularly in the area of further investment to address those challenges with communities, are critical. So thank you for your time and look forward to this discussion.
I'm going to stay seated, although I feel lower now, so I'm trying to have a look. So I'm going to finally just going to introduce Andrew. Dr. Andrew Forde is Principal Officer with oversight of the delivery of €1 billion of Rural Regeneration and Development Fund. You oversee that fund, the Town and Village Renewal Scheme, the National Tidy Towns Competition, Local Improvement Scheme, as well as the National Town Centre First Policy. And obviously you're based in the Department of Rural and Community Development. I suppose I got to know Andrew first when you were responsible for the development of the Rural Development Policy for Ireland, Our Rural Future, and also through your work with the National Social Enterprise Policy. Andrew is also a commissioner on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and I know has always been a really good supporter of trying to connect and collaborate with the Academy in as many ways as possible, because I think you really do see the benefits of it. Not to put words that you can't. So Andrew, I'd like to start with you. If you just had some initial thoughts you'd like to share with us. I think we've about 20-ish minutes. I'll keep an eye on the time.
Thanks, Karen, and you can tell me to stop whenever, because there's so much there that I could go on. Good to see you all. Thanks for the invitation, and Kieran, great to meet you. I'm going to just hone in on kind of 4.5 points from what I heard there, because so much of it resonates with my own experience of leading out of development of the National Rural Policy, and in terms of the delivery of some of the major capital funds. Though I will also dispel a bit of a fallacy myth around funding, because sometimes we think about rural development funding as being the key sort of lever for rural development, when in actual fact we need to be thinking right across government. So that's the first thing. First thing I pick up on is this idea of heterogeneity, that everywhere is different. This definition of rural was a conundrum that we kind of had to deal with when we developed the rural policy. And you have so many different definitions, and there's people in this room that are far better qualified to talk about that than I. But I think to distill it down to the basic point, it's the idea that everywhere is different. This is a very small, highly ruralized, low population density OECD member state. But within this country, you have two different jurisdictions, the Northwest and the rest. Within that, you have other peripheral island or other areas that are different again. Then you have, of course, towns and the hinterlands of towns that are benefiting in a way that other parts of rural Ireland are not. So everyone's understanding of rural is different. And I think that's the basic premise underpinning how government approaches funding and how government approaches policy, or at least it should be. So I think we have tried to feed that into the schemes that we're running, such that we're not delineating in too strict a fashion about what is rural and what is not. And the schemes are trying to accommodate for that sort of diversity. I think we need to keep that. I think we need to enhance that flexibility, actually. And that also, I suppose, fed in as a very fundamental part of the Town Centre First policy, which essentially speaks to what Kieran and Karen spoke about that bottom-up approach, about that. How do you really meaningfully ensure that people are at the centre of rural development? And how do you ensure that rural development is actually a sustainable proposition? That it's not a project proposition. That's more around empowering communities to take ownership for the vision of their area, their town, their region, and then ensure that the funding is there to meet that. So that's sort of, my first point is around the heterogeneity question. My second point is around the people-centeredness. This is so important, and it resonated through all the projects you spoke about. You spoke about this, and it was quite a startling thing you mentioned, Kieran, when you said that in one of the studies, 75% of respondents had felt that they lacked ownership, or they felt that their input wasn't valued or wasn't maybe not taken. That is something that we really need to bear in mind in a much more active way. When we developed our rural future, we carried out, I think it was one of the most extensive consultation processes that we had ever done. Thousands of people, events all over the country, partnered with academic institutions, the Royal Irish Academy. You know, I can go on and on. Online surveys, by the way, which was the most effective way to reach people, incidentally. Thousands of responses online, as opposed to some events where nobody would turn up in an evening in a rural hall or whatever the case may be. The point is, we need to move away from that model, which is a point in time snapshot, towards a more integrated approach, I think, where we have that ongoing conversation. And one of the, I suppose one of the things we try to do is to set up things like rural youth parliaments, where there's young people involved on an ongoing basis. Every year a different cohort, every year different priorities. And you know what? That's okay. That's good, actually. Likewise, ideas for us, partnerships with universities. So we need to think about that. But I suppose, you know, the rural department has a particular perspective on this. And from my perspective, is not doing too badly, could do a lot better. But across government, we need to do a lot better because it's not necessarily replicated. So first point, heterogeneity. Second point, people-centered. Third point, data. And it links to something you said there, Karen, around, you know, you and I have worked together now for many years on rural issues. And I feel very strongly, and you weren't putting words in my mouth, I feel very strongly that the gap between the academic and research sector, let's put it that way, and public policy needs to be narrowed more. It's a win-win solution for everybody. Policymakers like me, there's nothing that we feel more empowered with than data, credible data. When we go to our ministers, and frankly speaking, having tried to convince our ministers on certain issues, not least climate action. So for me, the issue is, how do we narrow that gap? It's you know, I always think about this quintuple helix approach, you know, the academia, industry, government, you know, civil society and the broader environment. How do we do that? We do that not just on a macro level, embedding that in policy. Collaboration with higher education institutions, for example, is part and parcel of our future. We have a higher education network, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we need to think on the micro level. How can the individual civil servant, the individual academic or researcher build those bridges themselves, try and forge out those connections and try to ensure that our research is relevant and is utilized? So that's my I don't know, third point. And then just to finish, and just to be a little bit controversial for the crack, can I talk about the funding fallacy? Okay, because I accept, of course, that there are, you know, you can never have enough funding. Like, let's be honest. And I also think, Kieran, your point is really well made around this issue of match funding. And one thing is available, an entirely different thing is accessible, you know, when it comes to trying to leverage resources. But money is not going to solve the problem. It's much more about how do we bring people along with us, particularly when it comes to climate action. I have the privilege of managing, as you said, Karen, something in the order of €1.5 billion. And frankly, that's an unprecedented amount of money for rural development related issues. The problem is not actually the money right now. The problem is delivering that into meaningful outcomes, meaningful, sustainable outcomes that are based on what people need on the ground. So I'm going to stop there. But thank you very much for inviting me. Fascinating discussion so far. Thank you.
No, thank you. I took my notes there, and you did before. No, that's great. I think maybe I might comment on that, and then we Kieran, if you want to give some feedback as well. You know, what we're seeing on the ground is exactly what you're saying around the funding, that there is an acknowledgement that there's more funding than ever. But I think it's also the capacity within communities, be that expertise, but also the reliance on volunteers, which you also brought up. And I thought it was we were looking at very different studies, but actually very similar findings coming out. And so I think that needs to be looked at. And I also feel, and maybe there is a role for university here as well, but monitoring and evaluation is a good thing. Even, you know, because there's a lot of success happening. We need to learn from that success, and where maybe there isn't success, where can it be improved, and not to be afraid to engage with monitoring and evaluation. And I know recently ESRI produced a document for monitoring framework for rural development. I think this needs to be expanded on even more. It's something that we were probably really good at 15, 20 years ago. And there was a lot of connection with universities in terms of evaluating projects. We're not seeing that as much. So maybe a little bit of thought on that would be useful. Kieran, would you like to respond in any way, and then I'll open it up to the floor?
Yeah, I think just your points in terms of, again, the connection between academia and decision making, and how do we have that at a local level within our work in the people's transition. One aspect we've been looking to is the idea of anchor institutions. So what are organizations that are at the center of communities that can really help to engage people, again, not just about the funding in terms of they can be a partner in funding, but in terms of engaging and getting that message, being a trusted source of information. So one great example, which came from the pilot project from the People's Transition in Phibsborough, was Bohemians Football Club have really become on board around the area of climate justice. So again, and my colleague Roisin Brady is working on a project now, Football for Climate Justice, which is, I suppose, applying an idea to people's transition with football clubs around Europe. So I suppose, who are the organisations on the ground between, not just, again, up high here in Dublin in government offices, but the organisations on the ground who can really help to bring communities together as well.